All right. All right. So Civil War. And again, these are all big, big concepts that I try to, get through in essentially 20 to 25 minutes. So I'll do my best to kind of go through it quickly and kind of hit the big keys, the big things that we want to know. So Civil War, 1861 to 1865. A little bit of the lead up to the Civil War first. So hopefully at this point we kind of have an idea of what the Civil War was, who the two sides were, and kind of what some of the issues were. Right? That should be some stuff that we're at least familiar with. If not, we'll go over it today. So hopefully by the end of today, you kind of have a better sense. So this map here is showing us the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Okay, so I know you can see it up here, but I'll just read it. The Missouri Compromise was legislation passed in 1820. So again, remember, 1861, so this is 40 years before we end up actually going to war, right? 1820, legislation passes this compromise that made the number of slave states equal to the number of free states. In other words, there could not be imbalance. You couldn't have more slave states than free states. You couldn't have more free states than slave states, right? And that was because from a political point of view, right, people on each side of the issue of slavery didn't want the other side to have control of the Senate or the House of Representatives in Congress so that they can make either anti-slavery laws or make pro-slavery laws. So they wanted to keep it kind of at a stalemate. So that was the first part of the compromise. The first part was there had to be an equal number of free and slave states. The second part of the compromise said from this point going forward, because again, remember, we have a lot of this unclaimed territory, right, that's now part of the United States. And when I say now, I mean in 1820, right? So in 1820, there's all of this unclaimed or claimed but unorganized land, right? So we have the Oregon territories, we have this big chunk of kind of reddish pink, whatever, the unorganized territory that was kind of unexplored but was part of the United States. And then we had the Arkansas territory down here. Point being that the United States was adding new states frequently at this point. I know that seems crazy to think about now because we haven't added a state in a long time, right? But at this point in time, new states were being created quickly. And so what the Missouri Compromise said was not only are the current states going to be split up equally, but every time there is a new state added to the United States, there has to be a counterpart added to it as well. In other words, if there is a state that comes in as a free state, they have to create a new state that is a slave state. That was the Missouri Compromise. And they basically set this line up, which was called the Missouri Compromise line, right? Everything south of that would be open to slavery, and everything north of that would be closed to slavery. The reason it's called the Missouri Compromise was because Missouri is north of that line, but wanted to allow slavery, and also that was required in order to balance the number of slave states. So that's why it's known as the Missouri Compromise. So going forward, they had said that anything added beyond these existing states, south of that would be a slave state, north of that would be a free state. Now, that didn't last very long, but it lasted a while. Okay, so that's kind of the lead up. So there's tension building for years and years and years and years. So 1820, the North was, at this point, anti-slavery. They didn't have a need for it. They didn't think it was moral. South their economy relied on it, and so it just became a bigger and bigger issue between the two sides. Okay, all right. So again, the Civil War. means, so when we talk about civil war, we mean a war amongst ourselves, right, or within the same country. So there are civil wars that have happened in all other types of countries all over the world, right? But our civil war happened between the northern states, which we refer to as the Union states, and the southern states, which we call the Confederacy. Okay? So that's kind of the two different sides at play. Let me see if I want to go through some. So some of the issues that I want to talk about. So sectionalism was the idea that immigrants and women added huge numbers to the workforce in the North, leading to an industrial boom. So you start to have this imbalance where the northern states, their economies are booming, new people are moving to the North, women are leaving the household and working, and so you have a much bigger workforce in the North, more businesses, more opportunities for jobs, and more money, more income, right? So the northern people have overall a much healthier and robust economy than the South, whereas the South is still predominantly agricultural based, meaning their livelihoods and their wealth is dependent on growing stuff, cotton, tobacco, sugar, all of those big crops, right? And those industries relied heavily on slaves, because we're talking about giant plantations where you had to have a lot of people to work those fields. And if you go from having free labor to paying that many people, your economy is going to take a huge hit. So the South said, well, we're already struggling compared to people in the North. The North is just trying to, stick it to us even more. And that was kind of the mindset they had. All right. So slavery had been abolished in the northern states by the early 1800s. And it just became, there was more and more pressure put on the South to do the same thing. And ultimately, what really was the last straw was Abraham Lincoln being elected in 1860, and he was staunchly anti-slavery. He was very conservative, and the Southern people feared that President Lincoln was kind of the worst case scenario for them, and so that was like the last straw. And so you had the Southern states actually secede and leave the United States. In other words, they said, we are no longer part of the United States. We are starting our own country. That actually happened, right? So the two kind of big issues leading to war, obviously one, slavery, two, states' rights. States' rights meaning, and these are, well, not slavery, but states' rights is still an issue today, right? How much power and how many freedoms do the states have versus the federal government? And that was ultimately one of the big, right? The Southern states were adamant in saying it's our right as states to say we allow this to happen, even though federally it isn't allowed, right? Okay, all right. So again, more maps, lots and lots of maps. Okay, so here's kind of the different sides. We have the Confederate states in gray. We have the Union states in blue. So one thing to point out here is you actually had a few states that were Union states. In other words, they stayed as part of the Union. They didn't leave and fight for the Confederates and join the Confederacy, but they allowed slavery. And so that these light blue states, Missouri, Kentucky, Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, these states were all states that allowed slavery, but decided to join the North when it came time for the Civil War. So the blue states are all states that fought for the North, and then you have down here the Confederates: Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. All right. So with that said, I'm going to run through this graph up here real quick. So on the north, for the Union side, their president was Abraham Lincoln. Obviously, the capital city was Washington, D.C., which is still our nation's capital today. Again, their main economy was industrial, right? Factories making stuff. And then Ulysses S. Grant was the head of the U.S. military on the Union side. So on the South, again, they left our country and started their own country. Their president was Jefferson Davis. Their capital was Richmond, Virginia. Again, their economy was primarily agricultural. And then Robert E. Lee was the head of the Confederate armed forces. Okay? So let's go ahead and skip through this. And so obviously, before I do move slides here, you can see that the territories stayed out of this. Right? They didn't have, they didn't need to pick a side. They essentially were part of the United States, but they weren't necessarily actively involved in this because they weren't yet developed states. There may have been there were people that lived there. They were not states actively involved on the Union. Just like with the American Revolution, there were obviously a ton of battles. I don't want to go through and talk about every single one of these. I'll just run through these kind of main ones that I have up here. But one important thing to notice, and I think it maybe comes up later in my PowerPoint, but I'll just say it now. Look at all of the battles. So the battles are all of these red stars, or red, whatever you want to call them. Right? But notice where they are. Okay? And this will come into play later. Almost the entire Civil War was fought on Southern soil, on the Confederate side. And so the reason I bring that up is just because if you look at pictures of the aftermath of war destroys. So what you had happen was after the war was over, the South was in ruins because all of these battles were fought primarily in the South. Okay? So you had, once the war was over and the North won, there was a lot of work left to do to kind of rebuild the South. And we'll get to that either tomorrow or the day after. But back to the battles here. So Fort Sumter was the first battle and really started the Civil War. Okay? And we had the South basically attacking the North, and the South wins. So after this battle, you had a handful of states that previously had not left the Union that did leave and say, we're going to side with the South. And those were, I think, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, those 4 states. But the point being, there were some even more states that left after Fort Sumter. Bull Run was a failed attempt by the Union to capture Richmond, their capital. So the South starts off with a lot of momentum. Right? They're winning battles. They're feeling confident, like they're going to win. Okay? Shiloh is where things kind of start to turn around. The Union victory, or the Union side wins. Stonewall Jackson, who was one of their major, one of the major leaders for the army on the Confederate side, is killed, and so they lose a significant leader and a lot of their momentum. Antietam, place up in Maryland, up here, and it was unclear who won. It was kind of undecided, but it was the bloodiest single day of the Civil War. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, was a Union victory and really kind of marked the end for the South. After losing in Gettysburg, the South kind of, writing was on the wall. And then finally, Appomattox Courthouse in 1865 was one of the last battles, and it was a decisive, or convincing Union victory, and it essentially ended all hopes for this. Again, don't worry about remembering all of those. I'm just kind of wanted to run through them briefly. So, Sumter, Appomattox, Bull Run, Edom. All right, so cut to, right? War is over, and again, that was a very brief run through, right? But the Gettysburg Address, probably something you've heard, was a famous speech by Abraham Lincoln commemorating the battle and the soldiers who fought and died. And the Emancipation Proclamation was, so these two things are often linked together. The Gettysburg Address was simply Lincoln's kind of most famous speech to the soldiers, honoring them and honoring the people who died. And the Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order, which is a law the president can sign into action without congressional approval, and it ordered all states to be anti-slavery or free states, freed slaves in all states. So those are the two kind of big pieces of history attached to Lincoln that you want to make sure. Gettysburg Address and Emancipation. Reconstruction is kind of what we're going to talk about tomorrow. So I'm going to stop the PowerPoint here and look up or pull up a couple of questions to go over with you, and then we will and actually I want to do a little bit slow right now. Bear with me here. I'm going to go over one question. All right. So number one here, and then I'm going to skip back to those questions that I was previously on and go over. So disregard this passage on 432. We kind of talked about causes of the Civil War. So it says, which of the following disagreements was a main Civil War? A, whether cotton should be the main crop in the South. B, whether slavery should continue to exist. C, whether the United States should stand westward. D, whether slavery should be territories in the West. Okay, so I bring this question up mostly because I knew this was something I didn't go into great detail on, and I wanted to emphasize it a little bit. So clearly, A is not correct, whether cotton should be the main crop. That wasn't an issue. And C wasn't an issue, whether the United States should expand westward. Everyone was in agreement on those two things. No one had any problem with the South growing cotton. No one had any issues with the United States expanding west. Everyone wanted that. But look at B and D. B says whether slavery should continue to exist. He says whether slavery should be permitted in territories in the West. So, yes, there were lots of Northerners who felt slavery shouldn't exist for moral reasons, but most specifically, and I kind of alluded to this when we talked about the Missouri Compromise, but didn't say it, and that's why I wanted to come back and do this question, is that the bigger issue, the bigger political issue in terms of how our country is run on a policy level. Now, of course, people thought it was immoral and wrong, but the issue that really divided the two sides was whether slavery was going to be allowed in territories to the West. Because, and it all came back to this issue of control and power in the government, right? Northerners were afraid that if territories were allowed to have slavery, then they would become states. They would have control over the government and institute pro-slavery laws. Same thing in the South. They were afraid that if slavery wasn't permitted in the West, then those territories would become free states and control and government and put in place laws that were anti-slavery. So even though, yes, the issue of whether slavery should exist was a major issue, and it was the driving force behind a lot of people at the time, behind their motives. But politically, the bigger issue was the issue of slavery in the new territory. B is actually the right answer. So I didn't really expect you to know that answer. I just kind of realized I didn't talk about it much, and that's why I wanted to go back to that one. So give me a second. I'll pull up just a couple more questions real fast, and then we'll call it a day. So, all right. Here's the couple questions that I wanted to do. And the first one here is pretty cut and dry, and it's also something we talked about. So list 4 states that permitted slavery but did not join the Confederacy. So again, if we're looking at this map, we would have to find slave states loyal to the Union, which is this light gray. And again, we talked about them: Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. These were the states that were loyal to the Union. In other words, they stayed on the side of the United States. They permitted slavery. More importantly, let's look at number 5, and I'll have you do number 5 more on your own. Number 5 says, the loyalty of Maryland was of crucial importance to the Union. Based on the map, which statement best explains why this was so? And our options are: A, the nation's capital was located nearby; B, the Confederate capital was located nearby, was located there; C, it was close to Fort Sumter, where the Civil War began; and D, important rail lines ran through Baltimore, Maryland. Okay, so again, even though Maryland permitted slavery, the Union really didn't want Maryland to join the Confederacy for one main reason, and it's one of these. Okay. So if the answer jumps out at you, great. If not, let's throw out a couple obvious ones. C, it was close to Fort Sumter, where the Civil War began. If you look on the map and find Fort Sumter, it's right here, South Carolina, not close to Maryland. So again, obvious if you're proficient at looking at maps and reading maps. If you're not good with maps, that might, these questions are going to be harder. Okay, so C, throw it out. Is there anything on this map that shows us anything about rail lines? Okay, I'm making sure that there isn't. I don't see anything on it, right? So even though, again, there probably were, right? It's probably a true statement. There probably were important rail lines that ran through Baltimore. But nothing on this map, nothing on the map shows us that. So you can't assume that that's true. So D, throw it out. So it's either A or B. The nation's capital was located nearby, or B, the Confederate capital was located there. Now, if you can find the U.S. capital and Confederate capital, they're close together. So you have Richmond, Virginia, Washington, D.C. They're both pretty close, and they're both relatively close to Maryland. Notice B says the Confederate capital was located there. Even though it's close, Richmond is not in Maryland. Okay? A says the nation's capital was located nearby. Washington, D.C. is very close to Maryland. Okay? Maryland essentially surrounds Washington, D.C. on both sides. Virginia on the other. Washington, D.C. right in the middle. Right? And it's not technically part of any state. It's its own district. But it's Washington, D.C. Okay? So Washington, D.C. is located very close to Maryland. So that's the answer. A, the nation's capital was located nearby. All right, so sorry for the kind of truncated class, but hopefully that was helpful. We'll stop there and pick up with the Reconstruction tomorrow. Talk about kind of the aftermath of the Civil War. So have a good day, and I will see everyone either for science this afternoon or I guess Monday if I don't see you then. So have a good weekend. All right. See you, everybody.